Hello, I'm Julia Fisher. Welcome to The Olive Tree, the program that introduces you to Jewish and Arab believers in Jesus living in Israel today. There are a number of Bible verses that refer to Israel being a light to the nations. But what does this mean? My guest today can explain the answer. He is Ron Cantor, and we met recently in Tel Aviv, where he now lives. Born into a traditional Jewish home, he grew up in America and for many years wasn't interested in God at all. However, a Christian friend talked to him, and gradually Ron started to believe. A serious car crash had a profound effect on his thinking, as Ron now picks up the story.
That happened about a month after I had started my schooling. I was thinking about the Lord at that time. I was thinking about the reality of God, and I decided to fast on Yom Kippur. That's the holiest day of the Jewish year when we try and get forgiven of our sins. So I fasted, hoping to find God, to find some answer. And at the end of the fast, I didn't feel forgiven. I was very hungry, but I felt very empty spiritually. And about a month later, I was with a friend. He was not serving the Lord, but he had been a believer. But he saw me, a Jewish guy that was searching, and he felt it was his duty to reach out to me. So he took me to a movie about Yeshua, about Jesus, and I was very touched by the movie, but I knew it was just a movie. And on the way home from that movie, I began to pray. I asked God, I said, I believe you're real. I didn't believe you were real a year ago, but I do believe you're real now. I need to know how to serve you. Show me what to do to serve you. Do I need to become an Orthodox Jew? Is it Yeshua? Is it Jesus? I don't know. Next thing I remember is he lost control of the car, and the car began to swerve from side to side, spun around, and flipped over upside down in a ditch. The car was totaled, but we weren't. We were actually untouched. We got out of the car, and there was only one house around, and we walked up to this one house. And I got to realize this was the first time I had ever prayed in my life, and I somehow managed to get in a car accident at the same time. So I was impressed at the power of prayer. And we walked up to this house, we knocked on the door, and these two wonderful believers in Yeshua answered the door. And before I knew it, I was sitting in the living room with the wife, and she was explaining to me the message of salvation. And I got to be honest with you, I didn't understand it. I said, if Jesus was the Son of God, the Messiah, why didn't he get off the cross and prove it? And again, she explained to me that he came to die for us, and she talked about blood and sacrifice, redemption. It made no sense to me, except for the fact that the power and presence of God fell upon me at that moment. And it was so strong, I have no human words to describe it other than the word electricity. And even that just falls short of explaining this presence that I was experiencing at that moment. And I just knew this is real. And I said, I believe. And I left that house a new person. I wrestled initially with my Jewishness because I didn't know if there was any other Jewish people in the world who believed in Jesus. And from what I had understood, that to believe in Yeshua was to say, I'm no longer a Jew. So when I began to read the New Testament, I was stunned that Mary was not actually Mary, but Miriam, a Jewish girl, that John wasn't a Baptist, but a Jewish prophet, that Jesus' Hebrew name was Yeshua, which literally means salvation, that all of his followers were Jewish, that the writers of the New Covenant were Jewish. So all these things were just a shock to me. And then one day I met this Jewish woman who was a believer, the first other Jewish person I'd met. And I said, yeah, I used to be Jewish too. And she put her finger in my face and she said, don't you ever say that again. You will always be Jewish. And that's when I understood that there is no contradiction to being Jewish and believing in Jesus.
Ron, I want to fast forward your story. You met your wife, who happens to be an Israeli, and you were still living in America at the time. You went to Bible college and you ended up in Florida, in Pensacola, at the time when the revival was starting there. That must have been a critical time for you.
Well, it was quite exciting. We had visited the revivals several times. Since I was a new believer, I'd always read books about the great revivals and longed to see something like that. A good friend of mine who became a key leader in the revival, Dr. Michael Brown, called me from the revival after his first visit, and I could hear in his voice that he was shaken. And he said, Ron, this is it. This is the real thing. Several years later, we were invited to come teach, and we joined the staff. And it was a real privilege to not just be in the midst of that revival, but to teach Jewish roots, Jewish history to, in my average class was over 500 students. And these young people were hungry for God, hungry for revival. and knew nothing about the Jewish roots of the gospel. It's interesting. One of those students was a man by the name of Daniel Kolenda, who has now become the president of CFAN. CFAN is the ministry that Reinhard Bonnke started. So here's a young man that I had the opportunity to 16 weeks pound into him a love for Israel, an appreciation for the Jewish roots of the faith, and now he's leading the largest evangelistic ministry in the world.
You didn't realize at the time, but that was to be a key contact for you. You came to Israel to live just a few years ago, and now you're running something called Isaiah 2. If I was to ask you, before we explain what that is, what you believe God is doing in Israel and the bigger picture, what would you say?
I would say he's opening up the eyes of Israelis. He is fulfilling his word that said that the Jews would come back to this country, but he didn't stop there. The Ezekiel 37 vision has two parts. The first part is dry bones getting bodies, but they're still dead. And then the second part is life coming into them. So I'd never be satisfied with just a bunch of dead. As cool as that is, as flesh coming on dead bodies or on bones, dead people are still dead people. And so the second part of that is the life of God coming back into Jewish people, coming back into Israelis. And we're seeing that, Israelis being born again. But there's even a third phase. When Paul in Acts, I think it's 13:47, he is in a specific city and he's sharing with Jewish people, and some had received and some didn't receive. And he said, you know what? We're going to go to the Gentiles now because we're called also to be a light to the nations. So we believe that God is emphasizing in Israel. We're so used as the Israeli body to receiving from other nations, people in Great Britain, in the U.S., all over Europe, Africa, praying for us, sending us finances, praying for the little feeble body of believers in Israel. Well, God is now calling us as the body of believers in Israel to rise up and to fulfill that calling, to be a light to the nations. And so it's not enough that we are sharing with Israelis. We also have an anointing and a calling to go out from this nation. Isaiah 2 says, Ki mitzion tetzeh haTorah u'davar Adonai mi Yerushalayim, and the law shall go forth from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So when we get on an airplane at Ben Gurion Airport as a team and we go to another nation in order to reach that nation as Israelis, as a delegation of Israelis going to reach people in that nation with the gospel, we're fulfilling prophecy.
And it's through that contact with your former student, Daniel, that you are now going and taking teams of young Israelis to Africa.
Yes, well, when I was in Africa the first time, it was just so amazing that I came back and I said, God, I have to go back there. I love Israel, but I can preach to more people in Africa in a weekend than a year in Israel. And I began to pray and seek the Lord for many months until I heard from a good friend of mine that this young fellow, Daniel Kolenda, former student, had become the heir apparent of Christ for All Nations, CFAN. And I felt like the Lord said, there's your open door, give him a call. And I did. And he invited me to come and be a part of one of their campaigns, really just to watch and see. And what I saw was like just ripping a page out of Matthew or Mark. It was phenomenal. The crowds. In fact, on the first night we were there was a dinner just in honor of Reinhard Bonnke. And we went to this dinner. And I remember getting out of the car and there were mobs of people not invited to the dinner. They just heard that Reinhard Bonnke was going to be there, much like in the New Covenant when they heard that Yeshua was coming to a city, the crowds would mob him and they just wanted to touch him, to receive prayer, anything. And for me, because nobody knew who I was getting out of that car, it was scary. I thought I was going to get trampled, but I was just amazed at the hunger of the people. And the next night was our first night of the campaign where a little over 350,000 people came out to hear the gospel. And that number grew over 5 nights to over 700,000. And we saw blind eyes open, the lame walk, just so many miracles. And while I was there, the Lord had spoken to me on the first day that he was going to open up a door. Well, on the last day, I'm on the way to the airport and I am full and I am happy and I'm blessed. I've seen things I had only dreamed about seeing, except no door had opened. And I was an hour from the airport and I said, Lord, you said you were going to open up a door and I'm getting ready to go home. And suddenly the fellow next to me, a fellow by the name of Pastor Mike Moses, a wonderful African pastor, he just turned to me and said, Ron, I want you to come back to Africa and preach the gospel. And we began to make plans for a campaign in the future. And I thought, wow, just in the last minute, the Lord opened up a door. Well, I got to my hotel. I had actually flown to another city and had to wait a whole day for my airplane back to Israel. And I got back to the hotel and I began to pray about it, and I was bothered by this invitation. I just had no peace about it. And I began to pray. I said, God, why don't I have peace about this? You said you were going to open up a door. A door is open, and I'm uncomfortable. And he spoke to me, and I don't want you to get the wrong idea. I don't have this ongoing conversation with God. I wish I did. But there are moments and there are times when God speaks so clearly, and you just know in your heart God has spoken. And he said, Ron, if you come back to Nigeria and preach the gospel, that'll be a great blessing for the people of Nigeria, but it will not touch Israel, and your calling is to Israelis. He said, but if you go back to Israel and you put together a team of young Israeli adults, born again, messianic, on fire young people, and bring them with you as a delegation from Israel, not only will you be blessing Nigeria, but you're going to bring blessing back to Israel. And so I got back to Israel and I shared this with leaders instantly. Their spirits bore witness. Before we knew it, we had a team of 18 ready to go. And we did it. We went to Gombe, Nigeria. We preached to literally tens of thousands of people. And I don't even want to say the numbers that they gave us. They were so beyond what we could have ever dreamed or imagined. I'll just say tens of thousands of decision cards came back over 5 nights of ministry. We saw blind eyes open. And not just me preaching, but our team, young Israeli school teacher from Beit Shemesh, getting up there and preaching her heart out. And afterwards praying for a blind woman. And the woman went home and she suddenly realized that she could see. She came back to the church and said, I have to testify and tell you that you prayed for me and now I can see. I wasn't even there. I was in another part of the region. So, and that was the goal. It wasn't about me or my ministry. It was about young Israelis coming and fulfilling their calling to be a light to the nations.
Ron Cantor, a Jewish believer living in Israel today. And you're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher, the program that brings you the stories of Jewish and Arab Christians living in Israel today. The Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a charity based in the UK that supports these people. If you'd like more information, please visit our website, www.olivetreefund.org. And if you'd like to receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please either email inquiries@olivetreefund.org or write to me, Julia Fisher, at the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, P.O. Box 850, Horsham, RH12 9GA in the UK. Join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.